Chapter 4 of Pursuit by Lester del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. She seemed surprised, but tried to smile. "I thought I left you asleep, Will," she said, in a tone that was meant to be bantering. "'S the matter? The fuse blow?" He accepted the excuse for his presence in the basement. "Yeah, it did. You left the iron on. I wondered what happened to you." "Nothing. Just shopping. There wasn't a bit of food in the place. And I must say, Will, you aren't much of a housekeeper. I bought pounds of soap." He followed her up the stairs, and his key opened the door. He was still operating on the general belief that they'd be least likely to spot him where they'd already found him once. If the girl had tipped them off, then they had it figured that he'd run off and probably wouldn't be back. He hoped so, at any rate. She was talking too briskly, and she was too careful not to mention that the iron was cool, with its cord wrapped neatly around the handle. He offered no explanation, but let her babble on about the strange coincidence of his being Will Hawkes, and how she had almost forgotten the childhood days. "How come the Ibanez?" he asked finally. "Stage name. I tried to make a go of musicals, but it wasn't my line, I found. But the name stuck." "And where'd you learn how to drug coffee that way?" She changed expressions. There was even a touch of a twinkle in her eye. "Waitress in a combination bar and restaurant. You needed the sleep, Will, and I guess I still feel as much a mother to you as I did when you used to get hurt so long ago." She had things out of the bags now, and he saw that she had been doing a lot of shopping. There had still been time enough to call the slim young man, though, or, he suddenly realized, the fat man. He had no more reason to believe her an enemy than a friend. Then he corrected that. If she'd known enough to call the fat man, and had been his friend, she could have told him things. She denied knowing anything, though. He couldn't understand why he trusted her. And yet, somehow, he did. Even if he knew she'd called them, he would still have to trust her. He was sure now that she was lying, and that she had been the girl at the door. But that meant she'd been with the fat man, and the fat man had seemed to be his friend. Or had the man been sent to lure him out, but miscalculated, and gotten only what had been meant for him? His head was spinning, and he gave up. He was a fool to trust her simply because the fear-feeling subsided around her, but he had nothing better to do than to follow his hunches, and then try to play the odds as best he could. "Cigarettes," she said, handing him a pack of his brand. "And for me, shoe dye. Your shoes need it, and I couldn't find a shoe store. I did get a shirt, though, and a tie. You'll find a hat in that bag. Size 7 1/4? He nodded gratefully and went in to change. His old shirt had caught most of the cat's blood, and he needed a fresh one. There were a couple of spots on his trousers, but they'd do, and the sports jacket matched well enough. He daubed the dye onto his shoes, one of the combined polish and dye things. "Cold cuts all right?" she asked, and he called back a vague answer that seemed to satisfy her. He was staring at the shoe dye. It worked fairly well when he experimented. He daubed it into his hair with a wisp of cotton. His hair began to mat down, but he found that combing it out as he went along removed the worst of the wax, and still left some of the color. It worked better than it should have done. He found a bottle of something that smelled of alcohol and belonged in her cosmetics, and began removing most of the mess. By being careful, he got the wax and most of the dye smell off, while leaving his hair darker. "Better wash up," she called. There was a razor among the things she had bought. He daubed some of the dye on his upper lip, where the stubble of a mustache was showing. It was easier there, if it didn't wash off in soap and water. Some of it did, but when he finished shaving, he felt better. It wouldn't pass close inspection, but he now seemed to have darker hair, and the dye had exaggerated the little beginning of a mustache enough to make some changes in his appearance. He waited for her to comment, but she said nothing. He waited for her questions about what he was going to do, and her explanations that, of course, he couldn't stay there. She merely went on talking idly while they ate. It didn't fit. Finally, he stood up and began taking down the rope that was strung up over one end of the room, to be used as a clothesline, he supposed. She looked up at that. "What?" "You can fight if you want to," he told her, "or you can save yourself the headache of being knocked out. Take your choice. People don't pay much attention to screams in a place like this, and I'm not going to harm you if you'll take it easy." "You mean it?" Her eyes were huge in her face, and there was a touch of fright now. She gulped visibly, and then seemed to go limp. "All right, Will. In the bedroom?" He nodded, and she went ahead of him. She didn't struggle until he was about to gag her. Then she drew her head aside. "There's money in my bag, if you're going out." He swore, hotly and sickly. If she'd only act just once as a normal female should. Maybe Irma had been a hysterical, cold-blooded fool, but she couldn't have been that much different from other women. Even the books indicated Ellen should be anything but so damn cooperative. "If you'll tell me what's going on, I'll still let you go," he suggested, drawing her hands tighter together. "I can't, Will. I don't know." He had to believe her. He knew she was telling the truth, at least to some extent, and that made it so much worse. He bound the gag over her mouth as gently as he could, and closed the door behind him. Her big eyes haunted him as he turned to the telephone. The information girl at CCNY could only tell him that Wilbur Hawkes had resigned abruptly 7 months before, and no one knew where he was. They had heard he was doing government research. He snorted at that. It was always the excuse, but nobody knew anything. He tried a few other numbers and gave up. Nobody knew, and nobody seemed to react to his name any differently from what they would have done had he remained a quiet, professorish man, minding his own business, instead of being chased by... He couldn't complete that. The idea was still too fantastic. Even if there were alien life forms that had subtly invaded Earth, why should they pick on him? What good could a little unimportant mathematician do them, particularly if they had the powers he already knew they possessed? It was a poor answer, though not harder to believe than that any group on Earth could suddenly come up with miracles. Anyhow, men knew enough already to be pretty sure that Mars and Venus wouldn't have creatures that could invade Earth, and the other planets were hopeless. Perhaps from another star, but that would mean violating the theories of mass increase with the speed of light, and he was not ready to accept that yet. This time he went out of the building without looking first. It could do no good. They could hide from him, he knew, and he would only call attention to himself by looking around. With the change in appearance, he might get by. He moved rapidly up Broadway, where he found a little clothing store and a ready-made suit that nearly fit him. The tailor there seemed unconcerned when he insisted the cuffs be turned up at once, and that he wanted to wear it immediately. It took nearly an hour, but he felt safe for a change. The 5 and 10 furnished a pair of heavy-rimmed glasses that seemed to have blanks in them, and he decided he might get by. There was no evidence of pursuit. He caught a cab and headed for the library. Ellen had been well heeled, suspiciously so for a girl who lived in a cold-water flat like that. He'd peeled 15 tens from her wallet, and there'd been more, not to mention the 20s. His conscience bothered him a bit, but he was in no position to worry too much. The library was still the puzzle of the ages to him. He'd used it half his life, and still found it impossible to guess why such a building had been chosen. But eventually he found the periodical room, and managed to get through the red tape enough to be given a small table with a stack of newspapers and magazines. The mathematics magazines interested him most. He pored through them, looking for a single hint of the things he had seen. Einstein's work with gravity stood out, but no real advances had come from it. It was still a philosophical rather than an actual attack on physics, as beautiful as a new theology, and about as hard to utilize. He skimmed through the pages, but nothing showed. No real advance had been made since his memory blanked out, except for one paper on a variable star which was interesting, but unhelpful. He threw them aside in disgust. He knew that it was useless to look in other languages. Work couldn't be done without some first stages that would be reported, and any significant new theory would be picked up and spread. Science wasn't yet completely under political wraps. For a second he stopped as he came to a paper bearing his byline. Then he grimaced. It was an old one, just published. His attempt to find how the phenomenon of poltergeist could be fitted into the conservation of energy, and his final proof that the whole business was sheer rubbish. It would be nice to be able to get back to life where he could fool around with such learned jokes. The newspapers, beginning with the last day he could remember, were almost as barren of results. There was a story of the Cold War, without the strange overtones that should be there if any of the major powers, where all the major scientists would tend to be, had found something new. He'd studied the statistical analysis of mob psychology at times, and felt sure he could spot the signs. He skimmed on without results until he finally came to the current paper. This he read more carefully. There was no mention of him, but he found something on the Fat Man. It was a simple follow-up to the story about the scientist who turned himself in at Bellevue. The man had mysteriously disappeared 3 hours later. There was a picture, the face of the Fat Man, with Professor Arthur Meinzer under it. It didn't help. Hawkes shoved the magazines and papers back and went through the series of halls and stairs that led him to the main reference room, inconveniently located on the top floor. He found the book he wanted and thumbed rapidly through it. Meinzer was listed on the bottom of page 972, but as he looked for 973, a pile of ashes dribbled onto the floor. There was no use. They'd gotten here ahead of him. He made one final attempt. He called the college and asked for Meinzer, to find that nobody even knew the name. He knew they were lying, but he could do nothing about that. Maybe it was only because of the publicity, or maybe someone or something had gotten to them first. Fear was growing with him as he came out on the street. He ducked into a crowd and headed slowly into a corner drugstore, trying to seem inconspicuous, but the fear mounted. They were near. They would get him. Run. Go. He fought it down and found that it was weakened, either by his becoming used to it or because the urgency was less than it had been. He ducked into a phone booth and called the newspaper, keeping his eyes on both entrances to the store. It seemed to take forever to locate the proper man there, but finally he had his connection. "Meinzer?" the voice said with a curious doubtfulness. "Oh, hey, mister, that story's dead. Call up." The telephone melted slowly, dropping into a little cold puddle on the floor. Hawkes had felt the tension mounting, and he was prepared for anything. Now he found himself on the street, darting across 42nd Street, against the light, without even remembering having left the booth. He stole a quick glance back, to see people staring at him with open mouths. He thought he saw a slim figure in gray tweeds, but he couldn't be sure, and there were probably thousands of such men in New York. He ducked into a bank, wormed his way around the various aisles, and out the back entrance. A cab was waiting there, and he held out a bill. "I'm late, buddy. Penn Station?" The cab driver took the bill and the hint and darted out just as the light was changing. Penn Station was as good a place to try to get lost from pursuit as any. Hawkes examined his wallet, considered trying to get a train out, but he'd used up nearly all he had taken from Ellen. And all his careful disguise had proved useless. They weren't fooled. And this business of dodging was wearing thin. By now, they'd know his habits. He drew out a coin, flipped it. It came up heads. He frowned, but there was nothing else to do. He moved down the ramp toward the subway that would carry him back to 66th and Broadway. He was probably walking into their trap by now, but the coin was right. He had to free Ellen. If they got him, it couldn't be much worse for him. Then he shuddered. He couldn't know whether it would be worse for his country, or even his world. He couldn't really know anything. The end of Chapter 4 of Pursuit by Lester del Rey.